Welcome back to another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, and today we're in the West End of Cincinnati at Revelation Baptist Church. I'm joined by Dr. Gary Zola and Reverend Todd Ingram. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. I'm going to come straight to you for the first question. When was the synagogue established?
So the synagogue came into existence in the year 1847. And this was a time here in Cincinnati when lots and lots of immigrants were coming from Central Europe. That's sort of how Cincinnati originally received its German roots, if you will. We had a lot of Central Europeans coming from Austria, Germany, the Baltic region, and in that group there were quite a number of Jewish immigrants. And so the number of synagogues in this community began to explode. And so this particular congregation, which was called Ahavat Achim in English, or in Hebrew Ahavat Achim, and they translated their name, in a very peculiar way. It may be the only place in the world where this Hebrew phrase is translated as it is. They translated it and became known in English as the Congregation of Brotherly Love. Of Love Brothers. Love Brothers. Oh. That's how they called it in English, Love Brothers. But the better phrase would be in Hebrew, the better, more accurate translation would be brotherly love. And yes. I have no idea, I've never found any reason why they translated it that way, but that's how they did. And I remember reading a document from this period where one newspaper said, our Jewish fellow citizens have created more congregations in our city than almost anywhere else in the country. Now, whether that was true or not, I don't know, but that was the impression that was given. And this was a very important congregation and began to grow immediately. Within a few weeks, they were meeting regularly, and then I would say it was in a couple of years, probably around the 1850s, they moved into a house. Okay. And then, in the 1860s, they began to erect this building here on John Street. And it was built really right after the Civil War, and I think it was 1866 when it was officially dedicated.
The original congregation of Revelation Baptist Church was 10 members that met on George Street. And they, too, parallel to Ahavat Achim, grew at a rapid pace, and they started in the year of 1921, became incorporated by the year of 1926, and were moving into this building by 1928.
Yes. Okay. Dr. Zola, how's his Hebrew?
I want you to know his Hebrew is much better than my Latin. I mean, it's impressive. Although I know Reverend Ingram, I know he knows his history. He and I, he does. He really does.
As you do too, yes. Dr. Zola, you mentioned earlier that the structure was erected in 1866. Can you expound on that?
Yes. Really, this building, I mean, think of it. It was really right after the Civil War, and Cincinnatians will be really impressed because one of the other synagogues that was built and dedicated almost at the same time is the Plum Street Temple, which still stands and still exists and is this magnificent, just world-famous structure. And what I think that goes to show is it was part of a statement that Jews here in Cincinnati were trying to make. They wanted the community to realize that they were here and they were part of the community. And in contrast to many places in Europe where synagogues were sort of hidden in places where you couldn't really see them, and if they were on the main street, their facade was often very unremarkable. There are exceptions to that, but that was common. It was clear in America that, especially in Cincinnati, that they wanted to make a statement. They wanted the community to realize that not only are we here, but we're important. And this congregation, Ahavat Achim, or Love Brothers, yes. This congregation's original building if you read the documents about it, it made quite a statement. People were very impressed. They described the interior during the dedication, its beautiful facade, and so forth. But it is important to note that the congregation was originally strictly Orthodox. And we can talk a little more about this because that will change. But in its original creation, it had a balcony for women because men and women didn't sit together, and there was no organ. There was just voices, no music on the Sabbath, and well, music, but you would sing, not have musical instruments. And so what's important about this is it really is one of the oldest structures still standing. There's one other that has a relationship with this congregation, which we can also talk about. Some of the folks in Cincinnati may know on Ruth Lyons Way, there is another synagogue building that's the same age, actually a little earlier. It was built in 1860. It's no longer a synagogue. It's not a church. It's actually a warehouse, though there's a little historic plaque on it. It still stands to this day, and that congregation was called Shereth Israel. And that in Hebrew means the remnant of Israel. And why that's important is later on, Ahavat Achim, or Love Brothers, and Shereth Israel, the remnant of Israel, will join together in this building and will become one merged congregation.
Okay, so now did it at that point, did it go from being Orthodox and now we're mixed?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
As we get closer to the 20th century, and as people in Cincinnati are more and more Americanized, they want a more modern approach to Judaism. They want their Jewish rituals to be more aligned with what everyone else is doing. So they want to pray in English, not only in Hebrew. They want music like in the that's similar to the music. I mean, they may be chanting Hebrew hymns, or they may be chanting Jewish themes in English, but they want that atmosphere that's going to be similar to what's going on in the world. And so, yes, it does, and that's really important because that's part of the Americanization of Judaism, and this congregation sort of embodies that. It starts out strictly Orthodox, but by the time the 20th century rolls around, the congregation is already what we would call a liberal congregation, a Reform congregation. Of course, Reform, this is one of the strongholds of Reform in all of America, right here in Cincinnati.
Nice. Now that actually reminds me, as he was telling me the story of how, this congregation had ties to just another one. When it started with you guys, there was a tie with Georgia. I want you to talk about the Revelation name.
The Revelation Baptist Church name has its origins actually in Alabama.
My bad. It's Alabama, not Georgia.
Yes. The founding pastor of this church, W.H. Thomas, had a very dear brother he was very fond of in Alabama who pastored a church by the name of Revelation.
You don't say Revelation, just like...
I don't know where Reverend Thomas got that thought, but I think he was very fond of his brother. I think he was very, very fond of his brother, and therefore we appropriated the name as well. But some of the things that Dr. Zola said really kind of gives me a wow moment because not only as the Jewish community was becoming very much in the forefront and gaining a presence in community. So therewith came this Revelation Baptist Church. In this move, even in 1928, that was a grand move for us to move from storefront housing and rental properties into actual purchasing of a solid stationary building that we planned on on gaining ownership with, and then becoming a beacon of this community, making a presence in this community for some years to come, and that's just really amazing to me how that seems to parallel where this congregation started and these love brothers, and as well as that's what we intend to be, brothers that are in Christian love.
I know there is some very interesting history as we've been discussing, so tell us Tell us some of the interesting stories that have happened here.
Well, I think one of the very interesting pieces in terms of Jewish history is that this location here marks the Jewish community's sort of incursion into what would eventually be called the West End. And there's probably two reasons why that's sort of interesting. One is when you have an Orthodox Jewish community on the Sabbath and on holidays, they wouldn't be permitted to ride in horse and carriage. That would be considered a form of work because you'd have to strap up your saddle and all those sorts of things. So, people walked to the synagogue. So you could assume that that meant there was a Jewish community taking shape here in at least enough, maybe 2 dozen people who found this convenient. On the other hand, people who know Cincinnati might say, well, wait a minute, John Street isn't that far from Plum Street. Why couldn't they just walk over to the Plum Street Temple?
Right.
Well, they wouldn't. The people who started this congregation and who built it here, they wouldn't have wanted to go to the Plum Street Temple because Plum Street Temple already had a big reputation of being a prominent Reform congregation, and they had an organ in that temple, and so forth. That's not what they would have wanted, even though eventually, and this is the most fascinating thing. Stick with me on this. The Love Brother congregation will merge with Shereth Israel congregation, and then they will move eventually, this merged congregation, out of this building, and they will move on to eventually Reading Road. And they become known together as Ahavath Achim, Shereth Israel, the Reading Road Synagogue. And that synagogue in the 20s and 30s will eventually merge with the Wise Temple. So the Plum Street Temple, which is where they would not have gone when they first founded, they ended up today being a part of the history of the Isaac M. Wise Temple.
Fascinating. Absolutely. And I've heard your end of this, and I think everyone deserves to know.
The irony of it seems to be, is that this temple started out to be a very much an Orthodox place, moving away from a Reform movement. And what we grew to be during the time frame of the 40s and 50s, a lot of resurgence. There was a great migration of people moving from the South to the North and settling in these cities, gaining jobs and moving into the West End community of Cincinnati, Ohio. We became what was possibly representing the Nouveau Church, the up newness of church. We had organs. Yes, we had a band. We had a pastor that implemented a duplex system, all these sort of systems in which to actually give the church a sort of business order, sort of less to it in terms of taking business, in terms of coming together and doing ministries, things of that nature. In fact, we were one of the churches that had an actual Sunday morning simulcast during service under this great pastor, George Sangster, during that time. And ironically and sadly, he died in the pulpit during one of those morning services as well. However, that still brings about a great change in the church, because following him comes Reverend Fred L. Shuttlesworth, leading with the civil rights movement, which brings along Dr. Martin Luther King, and then still positions this church to be a beacon in the community, very much a presence, as the temple was built to stand for, a place of presence.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, we talked earlier. You had kind of said historically within the black churches, the musical leaders were like rock stars. And I don't want to steal your words. I'd rather you talk about it.
Yeah, no, Reverend Ingram certainly can talk about this, but there was within the black church many composers, many talented artists who specialized in writing original hymns, original music for the black churches, and would be shared within them, but might not necessarily be known in the general community.
Right.
Their names might not even be known, but in their own community, they would have been considered very prominent. And one such person, and Reverend Ingram can talk about this, is a woman. The family name is still known here in Cincinnati, a woman by the name of Louise Shropshire. And
I want to come back because you have a neat thing on the end of this.
Yeah.
So who is Louise Shropshire? How do I say it?
Shropshire.
Shropshire.
Yeah, Shropshire. Well, she was a musician employed by the Revelation Baptist Church, and part of her duties was actually instructing our young rosebuds, our young choir. So she was over them for a long period of time during the 1950s up through the 60s and that era. During that time already, she had a song called "If My Jesus Will," and she performed it during a convention where Thomas A. Dorsey, who is given the nod as the father of gospel, the father of modern day gospel, suggested to her that she have that song copywritten. That kind of leads us to the modern day origin of "If My Jesus Will" being the song of origin for the civil rights movement song "We Shall Overcome." It all took place, so it is said, over a dinner that took place at the Shropshire's house up in Mount Auburn on Huntington Street, when Dr. King was in town for a visit with Reverend Shuttlesworth being the pastor here. They had dinner there and they frequented, and she played the song and talk engaged from there, and before you know it, we shall overcome.
Now, how do we know that she is the one responsible for that song?
Well, there is in Cincinnati a Cincinnatian by the name of Isaiah Gamboa, who both the Reverend and I know, and he's actually done research on this topic, probably more detailed than we can talk about on film, but he's actually published a book. This was then taken. He's done many interviews. He has an interview actually with Pete Seeger, in which he presents some of his evidence on film to Pete Seeger, and you have Pete Seeger saying, you may be right, and he's even gone to court and has received sort of the affirmation that. Yes, indeed, this is probably where the story, definitely where this song's melody and its birth took place. And it's a wonderful thing what Mr. Gamboa has done, because these musical geniuses who are part of the black church, they weren't worried about copyright. Right. They weren't worried about making money. They weren't worried about protecting their literary rights or their musical rights. That wasn't on their mind. And unfortunately, we know that very often people took advantage of that. Now, I'm not talking about either Reverend Shuttlesworth or Dr. King. I'm talking about the general community, and that's why, it was sort of ascribed to Pete Seeger, this very famous white folk singer, right, as being probably the author, because he helped to make the song famous. That's true. So I think in a way this wonderful story, which is located right here in this church, that's where it began, that is a story in which this woman who probably never thought for a moment of worrying about her fame or worrying about making a lot of money and copywriting and making sure that every single time this music was used, she received payment for it. In the end, thanks to Mr. Gamboa, she's getting at least historical credit for it.
Love it. And that I thought that was such a fascinating story when we were talking earlier. Do we want to touch at this point on the stone that is that's outside? So, Dr. Zola, let me start with you, because this is synagogue, and you were reading. Were you reading right to left earlier?
Yes. Hebrew is written like so many languages, is written from right to left. And well, that comes in handy as you get older, because if you are 85, if you read it right to left, you're only 58. So that can come in handy. But no, the way up high on probably it was probably on the balcony level, I imagine, there is this dedication stone that has been on the facade of the church all these years never been touched, even though after the synagogue left, it was sold first to a Lutheran church and then later to the Revelation Baptist Church. And we're working together with a group of people. We want to make sure when the building is taken down that stone is preserved.
Yes.
And it says on it simply, this is the holy congregation of, I hate to keep using this phrase, but love brothers, right? And that says that in Hebrew and then again in English, and then the date of its dedication in Hebrew date. And I think we're all wondering, could it possibly be that behind the stone is there a little metal dedication box or some kind of material that sometimes people do put behind dedication stones? Maybe not. Maybe all it is was just the sign on the building, but we'll find out.
Yes. And you too, you are working together to make sure that once everything that is carefully deconstructed.
Yes, very much so, and akin to the fact of making sure that the song had the right credits going to it back to Louise Shropshire. We here believe that that stone belongs to the Jewish community and a part of their history and has relevance within the Jewish community, and we wish it to be in the relevant place.
Yeah, I think I'd like to say one other thing in response to that. The Reverend and I have been working this past year on what's been transpiring. We've talked many times, and there are a number of black churches in our city that have come from synagogues, meaning that the synagogues, they've acquired either directly or down the line buildings that were historically once synagogues. Mm-hmm. And I know two or three of them, Zion Baptist on Reading Road, and all of them, right, Southern Baptist as well, as in the old Adath Israel building. And one of the most beautiful things in our community is, and without exception, these communities have maintained a relationship. They have sort of an awareness that there's this sort of historic connection. Yep. And there's, I know, for example, the Adath Israel congregation here in Cincinnati regularly has an exchange with their old home. And this is, I think, a beautiful thing, especially in the world in which we're living today, that where people come together for in mutual respect and support of one another's religious and cultural traditions, as opposed to being so critical, which is, I think, one of the nice things that we can say about this church and other black churches that have had a history with a building that once was a synagogue.
Dr. Zola, overall, the historical significance, if you can just as we're rounding this out.
Well, I think the way to look at this is this structure is, without question, one of the oldest standing synagogue buildings in this southern Ohio region. It's being erected and starting to be built in 65 and dedicated in 66. That's 1866. The Plum Street Temple, which was dedicated in 1866. The congregation that eventually joins together with this congregation, the remnants of its building still stands. These are the last really standing tributes to this remarkable community that came from Europe and settled here. And these beautiful buildings sort of represent their dreams for the future of their community. The Plum Street Temple, there's no doubt, is going to remain for as far as we can see into history. But these other buildings, this is now going to be a memory, and it's wonderful that what you have done and what we're doing is, in a sense, paying tribute. Hopefully, the pictures and the memories will live on.
Yeah, well, I couldn't think of two people to better represent it. And as for history, so goes the future for Revelation Baptist Church.
Where does the future lie for Revelation Baptist Church? Well, we hope to take the thread that has been twined together here and follow it forward as God leads us to other pieces of ministry. We're moving into a perfect condition, might I say that phrase now in this time? Yeah, almost a very good opportunistic condition to perform ministry, to serve the community. That's been our bailiwick. That's been our dog wheel for a long time.
And you're going to get increased opportunity with a food bank. I think you said hosting meetings for
part
grieving.
of the Mount Healthy Alliance. We're serving over 16,000 people annually. We're hosting Alcoholic Anonymous meetings at least 3 times weekly. We're working with the city's Board of Education collaboratively. So there is just so much opportunity to serve, and to serve even in an expanded manner from what we've been doing here. We've really showed ourselves to know what to do when it comes to grassroots movement, as far as being that sort of person in the community to really help socially. Really now I see a greater opportunity at a much wider range and level for us to perform and be involved in ministry. One of the things that we're saying here is that, the stone is going to go away. We hope for that to go back and be placed and forever cherished. The windows that are here, these were placed in by an artist named Van Gerichten, having stained glass houses in Munich as well as here. They date back to the 1800s. We'll be taking those windows with us. They'll live on. The memories will live on. The face table will live on. And the church will live on as well. We're not going away. We're just moving location.
Well said, Reverend Ingram. Very nice to have you, Dr. Zola. This was absolutely a wonderful collaboration of both the history and the future, and of course, being able to preserve all this and wishing FC Cincinnati the very best. Thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today at Revelation Baptist Church in the West End of Cincinnati. Reverend Ingram, thank you for joining us. Dr. Zola, thank you for joining us. And remember,
Travel slowly and stop often.
Bye for now.